Today is September 19th, 2022, and I would like to discuss the ongoing crisis between Azerbaijan and Armenia. These are two countries located in the Caucasus region, south of Russia, near Georgia. There is a flare-up of violence taking place. What is the Western media saying about this? This is a BBC article. Armenia, Azerbaijan, almost 100 killed in overnight clashes. And the BBC says, at the core of the dispute is the region of Nagorno-Karabakh. It is, according to internationally recognized borders, firmly a part of Azerbaijan, but is populated by ethnic Armenians. The cultural divide extends beyond politics into religion, too. Armenia is a majority Christian country, while Azerbaijan is mostly Muslim. Both countries were part of the Soviet Union before its dissolution at the end of 1991. The dispute has led to full-scale war in the 1980s and 1990s, a 6-week war in 2020, and continuing clashes for decades. A lot of commentators and analysts have noticed the very convenient timing of all of this. Another crisis along Russia's periphery at a time where Russia is engaged in a special military operation in Ukraine, as well as continued military operations in Syria, which began in 2015 and continue to today. Another fire along Russia's borders. Is it just a coincidence, or the United States doing this deliberately to extend Russia? Armenia is a member of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO. And under certain circumstances, members of the CSTO may have to come to each other's aid. And one of these members is Russia. So if Armenia is having a problem with Azerbaijan, Russia has obligations to try to help. This makes it even more likely that Russia is going to get dragged into this to further extend Russia. And I keep saying this phrase. That is actually literally the name of a paper by the Rand Corporation extending Russia, competing from advantageous ground. It was published in 2019. It is the blueprint of U.S. foreign policy. Every single policy suggestion in this paper has been implemented. Under Chapter 4, Geopolitical Measures, exploiting Armenian and Azeri tensions. And then under a subsection titled Measure 4, Exploit Tensions in the South Caucasus. Russia also plays a key role with Azerbaijan and Armenia, particularly over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, ethnically Armenian but geographically located within Azerbaijan. Nagorno-Karabakh's bid to join the Armenia Soviet Socialist Republic during the latter years of the Soviet Union was denied by the Soviet Politburo because of the risk of encouraging secessionist movements elsewhere. In 1992, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Armenia and Azerbaijan declared independence and fought a war over this enclave. The war ended with Armenian forces controlling Nagorno-Karabakh and some surrounding provinces, and Russia brokered a ceasefire in May 1994. Armenia and Azerbaijan never reached a final peace agreement, and armed clashes continue to this day. The United States could extend Russia in the Caucasus in two ways. First, the United States could push for a closer NATO relationship with Georgia and Azerbaijan, likely leading Russia to strengthen its military presence in South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Armenia, and southern Russia. Alternatively, the United States could try to induce Armenia to break with Russia. Although a long-standing Russian partner, Armenia has also developed ties with the West. It provides troops to NATO-led operations in Afghanistan and is a member of NATO's Partnership for Peace, and is also recently agreed to strengthen its political ties with the European Union. The United States might try to encourage Armenia to move fully into the NATO orbit. If the United States were to succeed in this policy, then Russia might be forced to withdraw from its army base at Gyumri and an army and air base near Yerevan, currently leased until 2044, and divert even more resources to its southern military district. And now we see this plan being implemented at a very critical time for Russia while it is dealing with Ukraine and also the situation in Syria. And we can then see the US encouraging Azerbaijan, or creating the conditions under which Azerbaijan will attack Armenia, and then the US inserting itself into the subsequent crisis. In order for Armenia to pivot toward NATO, it would have to leave the CSTO. So wouldn't you know that there are now protests in Armenia demanding that the country withdraw from the CSTO. Here's an article from HETK online. Yerevan protesters demand Armenia's withdrawal from CSTO. Several hundred people gathered in downtown Yerevan today demanding that Armenia leave the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization. The demonstrators say CSTO, of which Armenia is a member, has not come to the aid of Armenia following this week's Azerbaijani attacks along the Armenia-Azerbaijan border. Azerbaijani artillery fire targeted several towns within Armenia. That was the whole purpose of them doing that, to create the pretext for these protesters to come out. The demonstrators argue that CSTO has violated its treaty obligation to forthrightly condemn the latest round of Azerbaijani aggression against a member state. This media platform is part of the Global Investigative Journalism Network. And if you go to their website, you will see that they are funded by George Soros's Open Society. It's located in Maryland. So it is a Western-funded front that in turn funds these small media organizations. And it's being amplified by US-funded propaganda. So this is a US government-funded propaganda network creating and pushing this narrative that Armenia has been betrayed by the CSTO and should leave the CSTO and join what they're calling the United States, France, European Union civilized system, or the rules-based international order. U.S. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, this is from Reuters, Pelosi condemns Azerbaijan's attack on Armenia. And it's most likely the U.S. who gave them the green light to attack in the first place. And now they're leveraging violence that they themselves are encouraging to get Armenia drawn into what essentially is a mafia-style protection racket. This is what Reuters says. U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi arrived Saturday in Armenia, days after the Caucasus country's deadly border clashes with Azerbaijan jeopardized Western efforts to broker lasting peace between the arch foes. It is literally on the other side of the planet from the United States. Somehow, the U.S. is inserting itself into the middle of this crisis they themselves have helped create. And then we have this Al Jazeera article. Pelosi slams Azerbaijan's illegal attacks during Armenia visit. And Al Jazeera says, the United States, Pelosi said, was listening to Armenia about what its defense needs were and said Washington wanted to support the country in what she cast as a global struggle between democracy and autocracy. And really what that means when they say that is a battle between U.S. primacy over the entire planet and any nation that disagrees with that, which primarily means Russia and China. And then, of course, no nation is allowed to be neutral. They must pick a side. The U.S. will force them to pick a side. They either side with the U.S. and become proxies of the U.S., used and abused as battering rams against their adversaries, or they will be subverted, divided, and destroyed. The Al Jazeera article continues. It says, Pelosi also said she found it interesting that Armenia was unsatisfied with the response from the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization. A senior Armenian official expressed unhappiness last week with the Russian-led military alliance's response to Yerevan's request for help. We are very dissatisfied, of course. The expectations we had were not justified. Parliamentary Speaker Alan Simonyan told national television, likening the CSTO to a pistol that did not shoot bullets, according to Interfax news agency. So who is this Alan Simonyan? He's the president of Armenia's National Assembly, and he is also a guy who likes to hang out with the president of the National Endowment for Democracy. At the meeting with president of the National Endowment for Democracy, Damon Wilson, a talk was held on the works of the National Assembly of the 8th Convocation, as well as the legislative reforms of priority to be designed in a number of spheres. What does the United States have to do with Armenia's internal political affairs? These agreements to work with civil society is just a way of subordinating a nation's parliament to US-funded networks of so-called civil society organizations. And the US does this all over the world, and they're doing it in Armenia. The American partners highlighted the initiatives intended for free press and values of democracy in Armenia. When they say free press, they're talking about these websites just blatantly funded by the US government, spreading US propaganda to advance US interests at the cost of the interests of the people living in the targeted country. The US government has a parliamentary program ongoing right at the heart of Armenian internal political affairs. This is how the US is influencing elections in Armenia, and then in turn affecting and influencing legislation in Armenia. In the Rand Corporation 2019 paper extending Russia, when they talked about flipping Armenia, that's what they meant, taking over their internal political system, overriding it with US-funded parallel institutions, or just replacing the people in existing institutions, and then directing Armenia on a path that serves US interests at the cost of Armenia's. And this is the same exact process that the US subjected Ukraine to from 2014 onward. As a matter of fact, before 2014, the US was pumping millions, if not billions of dollars into Ukraine's internal political affairs through the National Endowment for Democracy and its various subsidiaries. They were building up opposition groups. They were creating opposition parties, maneuvering them into power. And then they sponsored the coup that ultimately overthrew the elected government of Ukraine and installed a US client regime that from that point onward served Western interests, Washington's interests, London and Brussels' interests at the cost of Ukraine's best interests. The elected government of Ukraine, however imperfect in 2014 when it was ousted, was performing a balancing act between Russia and the West. Their economy was heavily dependent on cooperation with Russia in terms of industry. When the US overthrew Ukraine's government in 2014, all of that was stopped and it cratered Ukraine's economy. From that point onward, working with Russia in any shape, form, or way was not an option. The US forces a nation to pick sides. They don't get to be neutral and serve their own best interests. They are subordinated to US interests. That is what happened to Ukraine. What do we call it when a foreign government targets another country, gets involved in its internal political affairs, begins reorganizing it, begins influencing who gets into power, how they get into power, what they do? We call that foreign interference. It is a blatant violation of the UN Charter. It is foreign interference. It is the modern day manifestation of imperialism. It is the US imposing itself on Armenia, its political system, and ultimately its future, its domestic and foreign policies. That is written in the Rand Corporation 2019 document extending Russia and pulling it into NATO. Will Armenia be safer or more prosperous under the protection of NATO? Just ask Ukraine. The answer is no. The US is doing this in Armenia. It did it in Ukraine in 2014. This is why there is this conflict growing between the US and China over Taiwan. The US put a client regime into power in Taiwan that is now separatist in nature, is violating China's sovereignty, its territorial integrity. The US does this absolutely everywhere. It's doing it right here in Thailand. The current Thai government, current Thai institutions have been growing closer and closer with China. The US doesn't like that, so they are funding opposition groups, taking to the streets, protesting, attempting to oust the current government, destroy Thailand's current institutions, and replace them with institutions that serve not Thailand's best interests, but Washington's best interests. US Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, she's in Armenia. She's offering Armenia protection. This is like when the mafia comes and offers you protection. They are protecting you from violence that they will subject you to if you don't pay them. That's why it's called a protection racket and not just paying for protection. It is something other than what it appears. Is the United States going to protect Armenia? No, they are threatening Armenia. I mean, do people notice that the same urgency and concern that the US showed for Ukraine is absent. We have Nancy Pelosi in Armenia, but she is there to present an offer to Armenia that it can't refuse. Between the Rand Corporation paper in 2019, which really spells it out, to the events unfolding exactly as they were spelled out, together with the US government funding behind the organizations promoting these protests, demanding that Armenia withdraw from the CSTO, I think it's very clear what's happening. So again, the aftermath is very predictable. Again, look at Ukraine from 2014 onward.